In this video, we'll construct the beret from the pattern we made earlier. I'm working with muslin as my fashion fabric, a polyester satin lining, an inexpensive fusible interfacing, and we'll need a little bit of lightweight buckram, but we'll use that later. I'm going to layer all of my fabrics to make it quicker to cut everything out. I'm going to lay out the pattern piece, weigh it down, and use a rotary cutter. I'm also going to go ahead and apply the fusible interfacing off camera just to save some time. Make sure you mark your notches on every layer. I'm using a permanent marker so you can see it, but please use something that's way more manageable and that you can get out of the fabric easily. Repeat this process for the rest of the pieces. For the crown, you'll need 2 of everything. For the headband, 1 of the fabric, 1 of the interfacing. And this is the lightweight buckram. I'm just going to cut a 1-inch strip. That's all you need, so you can just get a small amount of this from the store. You can get this at anywhere that they sell fabrics. Make sure it's the exact same size as the headband. Now, right sides together, you're going to take 2 ends of the crown pieces and you're going to sew them together. I'm using a 3/8" seam allowance as dictated by my pattern. Now you're going to finger press this open and you're going to edge stitch the seam allowance down to the outside. And this just keeps the seam allowance in place, and I think it gives it more of a sporty edge. You don't have to do this if you don't want to, but I think it looks more professional. And repeat this for the other side of the seam. And then once you're done with that, you're going to repeat for the other seam on the crown. Now stay stitch the outside and inside edges of the crown less than your seam allowance. So for me, that's about 1/4 inch. This helps to keep everything from stretching, and this next step, which is clipping the outside edge, helps to ease it into the tip a lot easier. Now match the tip right sides together to the crown and match all those notches. Put as many pins as you need, and you're going to sew along that edge, and you'll see that it's going to be, because the stay stitching is smaller than the seam allowance, you're not going to see the stay stitching when the seam is completed. And this is your crown turned right side out. The next step is to edge stitch these seam allowances down as well. And this, again, you don't have to do this step, but I think it makes it look more professional and kind of gives it a better shape when the hat is done. So you're just going to sort of slightly finger press open the seam allowance, and you're going to edge stitch just against that seam. Use your fingers for this. Don't take this to an iron. It's impossible to get it flat over an iron with a round surface like this. So just keep everything taut and just go slow and use your fingers to open up the seam allowance and then stitch along that edge. It's just to the inside or outside of the edge, depending on which side of the seam allowance you're doing. And once you do one side, the other side will be way easier because it'll already be flattened. And now you see one side is completely edge stitched. Now repeat for the other side. And again, this is way easier because the other side's flattened, and you just need to make sure you keep everything free and keep everything taut under the needle. And this is the finished edge stitching on there. Now for the headband, you're just going to sew the 2 ends together, right sides together. Now you're going to finger press this seam open, and you're going to edge stitch to each side of it just like you did on the crown. You're also going to repeat the exact same steps for the crown construction on the lining. So once you have that done, you can begin to build the crown of the beret. You're going to insert the lining into the fashion fabric, wrong sides together, matching seams, and then matching extra notches. Use as many pins as you need to hold it together. You're going to baste the two edges with a long stitch on the machine. If you want, you can do this by hand. Now, this is the completed crown with a lining on the inside. Now, take the two ends of the buckram and sew them together with the seam allowance and finger press open the seam. You do not need to edge stitch this. On the headband fabric, you're going to fold the two raw edges together and press with an iron. Then you're going to slip the buckram band into the groove created by the pressing. And this helps to stabilize the band as it's on the head as it's being worn. So just the two raw edges, you're going to pin those together all the way around and making sure you really get that buckram deep into that fold. You don't want it getting caught in the sewing machine later on at the raw edge. Now you're going to baste the two raw edges together. And now you're going to edge stitch the folded edge, which will catch the buckram, which is what we want. Now you're going to pin the headband to the beret, to the outside, to the fashion fabric. You're going to match the seam of the headband to the center back of the beret, and then match the notches all the way around the rest of the edge. You want to make sure that that headband is on the fashion fabric, not to the inside of the lining. Just use as many pins as you need to hold it together. Now you're going to sew that edge at your seam allowance, which in my case is 3/8, and this is going to be a regular stitch all the way around, making sure you don't catch any tucks or pleats from the beret into the headband. Now we need to take care of this raw edge. You don't really have to do a whole lot to this. All I do is pink it with pinking shears. I don't like serging this edge because I think the thread from the serging adds too much bulk. So I typically just pink and leave it alone. You're more than welcome to not do anything. You can actually just do a second stitch around this or a machine zigzag if you're worried about it, but pinking is fine. Now we're going to press the seam allowance towards the headband, and we're going to understitch just along that edge to the outside to the outside headband. This will ensure that the headband tucks in underneath so it doesn't pop out to the outside. And this is just again, a little edge stitch with the seam allowance tucked towards the headband, and that prevents it from rolling to the outside. And you'll see how easily, once we turn this right side out, you'll see how easily that headband wants to roll to the inside. It's a very nice thing to do, and it keeps the headband in place. Now, just make sure as you're doing this, you're gonna sort of roll the seam against the headband and make sure that it's nice and tight against that headband. No droops or anything like that happening beyond the headband. Now we're going to stitch in the ditch on the crown side seam over the headband as insurance, just to make sure that that headband's not going to go anywhere. So again, always use matching thread for this because you'll never be able to see it. And you're just going to keep that seam nice and taut, and you're going to go ahead and stitch directly in the center, really on the stitches that create the seam there. Just a back stitch before and after, and you just need to go the length of the head size, the headband, and you'll see that it just holds it in place. Now for the center front and center back that don't have seams, you're going to do a little stitch at the against the lining and the headband. You just want to make sure that you're not catching the outside fashion fabric. So just do a couple little hand stitches, a couple little knots, You're just making sure that this headband isn't going to flop around on you. Now I'm going to do this special knot here, and this is to finish it off. You basically just take through a loop like you'd normally do, and then you see this extra loop created. If you'll go through that and pull tight slowly, what it does is it secures the thread so you don't have to do any extra knots on it. It's now secure and that thread isn't going anywhere. Now you can just bury the thread in between the two layers of the headband and clip it really close to the fabric, and the thread won't pop out. And you can see that it's not caught on the outside, it's just caught to the lining. You can do anything you want to the top of this beret. I'm going to do a stalk. You can put a button, a bow. You don't have to put anything up there. It's up to you. But I'm going to show you how to do a stalk. So what you need is a little strip of bias, about 1.5 to 2 inches. And you're going to sew just shy of 1/4 inch on the folded edge. And you're basically creating a little tube. And you want to clip the edges and make it longer than you need. You don't need to do it exactly the same size because you want to be able to trim off if you need to. Now you're going to narrow one end of the seam allowance, just taper it in a little bit. Using a loop turner, you're going to, you can get these anywhere. You're going to put it into the tube, and you're going to catch the tube with the latch, and you're going to pull the tube through with the help of the loop turner. And just go slowly with this, it'll turn. And this is basically the shape of the stalk. The seam allowance inside helps hold its shape. Now, what you're going to do is take an awl or a pin, and you're going to turn under the raw edge on one end of the stalk. And this just makes sure that when it doesn't fray as it's being worn or over time. And just take your time, and you're just poking in that seam allowance a little bit, and you're rolling in between your fingers and getting it to where the seam allowance is tucked under, and you have a nice smooth folded edge at one end of the stalk. Now on the other end, you're going to decide how long you want it and leave an extra 1/4 inch. And then you're going to repeat the process by turning under the seam allowance on this end as well, using the awl or a pin. Now, I've previously marked the center of my beret when I was marking my fabric, but if you didn't, you can just use the pattern and find the center again. You're going to sew a couple of stitches just to the fashion fabric, not catching the lining. This is very important. You don't want that lining to be caught at this center point. Just a couple of knots just to secure it. And you're going to sew the stalk on. I want you to think of that folded edge, because it is round. It's a little circle down there. So you want to think of those as compass points. You need to stitch at north, south, east, and west. And you need to just catch the north or south point on the roll of the stalk, on that folded edge. And what you're going to do is just do a couple of stitches to hold it down to the beret. And I usually do a stitch and a knot. And then I'm going to carry the thread in between the fashion fabric and the lining to the next compass point and do the same thing. And once you get all 4 compass points, the stalk will stand up on its own. And if you want, you can go ahead and do more stitches in the extra spaces in between, but you really don't need to if you secured it well enough. But it's up to you. Depending on the fabric you're working with, you find that it needs more support, you can do more stitches. But you can see that just by doing 2 stitches, the stalk automatically wants to stand up. So you're just going to do a couple of stitches at each compass point, so to speak, and catch it with a knot. And then you can do that funny stitch I showed you with the second loop to secure it. And then you're going to bury the thread in between the fashion fabric and the lining. And you can see with the seam allowance on the inside of the tube and catching those 4 compass points, your stalk is going to stand up on its own. And that completes the beret. If you have any questions, let me know in the comments section and look for future videos on different styles of hat patterns.